Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you and welcome to this meeting with Rebecca Makkai to present her new novel. On behalf of Sexto Piso publishing house, I want to thank you all to welcome you here. Also to thank Telefónica. We are very happy to have Rebecca Makkai again here in Spain. We are publishing her second novel after The Great Believers that we published in 2021. That novel received an award in Catalonia and many other awards in the United States as well. Finally, she's here with another novel, highly expected by her readers, and we are very, very happy to be introducing her to her audience in Madrid. We also have María Jesús Espinosa de los Monteros, journalist here in Spain, great journalist who is going to help us in asking Rebecca Makkai all the questions that we have for her. If you want, we will also have we will open the floor for the audience for a Q&A session, and Rebecca will be signing her books also for you after the event. Thank you to all of you again.
Bueno, muchísimas.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Rebecca. I was going to joke saying I have a few questions for you, but he already said that, so I won't be that original. As you heard, this is a new novel by Rebecca after the success of The Great Believers. Both novels have been published by Sexto Piso, and when they told me, when they suggested that I could introduce this book, I was very excited about it because I think that it has four of the things that I like best in the world. Well, there are some more, but I really like these things. First of all, the podcast, which is the format that I've been dedicating the last few years in my life. So for a novel to have a podcast as one of the main aspects, it was important for me. Then true crime, because I have mixed feelings about the true crime genre. I am addicted to hearing true crime pieces, but sometimes I feel bad about it. Then third, it's not a campus novel because it's not a university campus, but it's that kind of atmosphere and what we see in private schools and boarding schools. So I think that's interesting for novels, for fiction. And it's a place where it's very cold. That's the last thing. That's I really like to have in novels, cold places, and also in movies. I like that. And I was telling Rebecca that I've been a teacher teaching podcasting in Spain, so I felt identified, but I didn't reopen a true crime case. But I felt identified with Bobby Kane, the narrator in this novel. She's the author of a successful podcast, a true crime podcast in the US, and she's invited to Granbury School, where she graduated in 1995. I think that decade is very important for the novel, and we will talk about that with Rebecca. And then the other main character, which is absent, but we hear about her in the podcast, and she's one of the true crime victims that we often see. That's Talia Keith, one of the old classmates of the main character, was murdered, and I don't want to say much more because it's a very addictive model. It's fascinating, and I don't want to spoil anything. But well, that's on the cover of the book, so up to here I can tell you. When Bodhi goes back to her school to teach the podcasting lessons, she'll try to reopen the case together with the students, and she'll try to discover whether Omar Evans, who was declared guilty of that Marder, the black athleticism coach. She's going to try and discover if he's really the martyr. But well, you are here to listen to us, but also to find out about the novel. And I was telling Rebecca that many of us who have listened to classic true crime podcasts, we were talking about Serial, about Bunnies, about many other podcasts, and we see here how it's transferred to that podcast world. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, Rebecca, about here with the audience, I asked you before, but were you actually a podcast listener before? What is it that it's appealing for you in that format, or about the narrative, the grammar that is characteristic of the podcast, the anchors that they use? Was it useful for you to write the novel?
Yeah, I certainly have been listening to podcasts since they started coming out. I'm someone who I get very bored very easily, so if I'm folding laundry or chopping vegetables, it helps a lot to have something to listen to, whether that is an audio book, a novel, fiction, or a podcast. Only very few of the podcasts that I listen to are concerned with true crime. I myself prefer podcasts that are kind of educational, where you learn the history of something. It's funny, and everyone does this, misremembers. So Bodhi's podcast is not a true crime podcast. It's about Hollywood history. But everyone, when they summarize the book, says, "Oh, she has a true crime podcast," because I think that's our assumption. Do we need to fix something with the microphones? Are we?
Me quito el pendiente.
Yeah,
Listo.
I took mine out already. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, but so I like that kind of podcast where you're really digging into the history of something and learning something. But I've always been drawn to unsolved mysteries, things that might have been wrongly solved. And podcasting is simply a new medium for those. We have a lot of new media, actually, around that kind of story, because now we have many-part Netflix specials. That's a new thing. We have online forums where you can dig into the history of a crime. Those are all new. So what's changed, I think, is not human interest in true crime. It's that we now have so much media available to us that you could fill all of your free time with that, or you could learn everything in the world that there is, at least everything that it seems that you could learn about one case that you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
See, if I'm not wrong, you started thinking about this novel in 2018, a very important year in the US with all the Me Too movement. How do you think that everything that movement meant influenced your novel? Do you think that you would have written a novel like this without the Me Too movement? Because it feels like that year, finally, many women, we stopped to think how men had been treating us for a long time throughout our lives, saying the Bing Crosby and Harvey Weinstein's cases. And I don't know if for you it was like a trigger in a way, if it made you want to write this novel.
No, I certainly already planned to write this novel, which was about someone in the present looking back on her time in school. But it definitely colored what that novel then looked like. And like everyone, I was doing that, looking back, kind of excavating my own past, thinking about not only the bigger things that I'd always remembered, but the smaller things that I might have forgotten about, including the things that I thought I was supposed to be okay with. I thought I was supposed to laugh it off. And in fact, if I ever had a problem with someone's behavior, that was my fault. I didn't get the joke. I was, let alone if I had gone to some authority figure, I would have been shunned socially forever, as many of us would have been, right? And looking back on that and not only rethinking those, but talking then to other women and realizing, oh no, all of us were upset by this. I wasn't the only one. We were all pretending to be okay with certain things. So that absolutely, that feeling of kind of looking back and going, wait a second, that came into the book. And then, of course, this is something that is generally in my character's mind as she returns to her school. She's thinking about former teachers, former classmates, and there is that feeling to it of looking back. But also, a bit later in the book, there is a literal Me Too plotline involving her ex-husband, something, where he's really canceled online. And of course, that plotline would not have existed without Me Too. So it was not the thing that led me into writing the novel. I think I just would have written a different novel that was also about looking back on boarding school, but it would have had a different tone to it, certainly if I'd written it 10 years ago, or if Me Too hadn't happened.
En estos meses.
During these months in Spain, in the diary El País, they've been publishing the Spanish Me Too, or what we call the Spanish Me Too, similar facts to what you lived in the United States, but in our country, revealing different kind of abusive behaviors towards women. And I've been reading what was happening, and at the same time I was reading your novel, and I was wondering whether you have an idea of what is that mysterious click that changes people, that makes victims decide to want to speak up, because sometimes it's something very mysterious, very intimate. So when do people start listening, or when does the society start listening? Because sometimes it looks like we're ignoring it, and then suddenly we start listening to these things, and then finally things change. That's the last step. I don't know if you have an answer for that, because I understand it's difficult.
Yeah, I don't think I have the answer. One of the things that surprised me most about Me Too was I thought it was going to be like people using that hashtag for a couple of days, and that we were going to forget about it again, because that's always what happened. People speak out against someone, one person gets in trouble, prosecuted, we forget about it, and then 3 years later there's another person, and everyone says, oh, they're probably making it up. Why did they wait so long? This can't be true. People speak up, and then we forget about it. And I think there was something, certainly it had to do with social media, it had to do with the use of that hashtag that invited everyone's participation. And I think that so often, in any case like that, what allows people to come forward is strength in numbers. So maybe it's, that many women are accusing the same actor of something, or in this case, just many people were talking about different instances. You feel like you're not the only one. You don't feel as much like you will be shunned if you speak out. And there's a tipping point somewhere in there where enough people are speaking that you feel like, oh, I have something to contribute to this. Maybe people, for me, I don't think that as an adult, it has been a long time since I felt uneasy speaking out about that, but you just don't feel like you have a reason to. For other people, they really have been scared for, many reasons to speak out. So maybe those people are getting the courage. And for someone like me, it was just like, oh yeah, I have some stories I can tell you. And I'm contributing those. And then I think also for people, maybe, men or other people who have not really realized how widespread a problem like this is, start to hear from everyone, not just people in the news, but all the women in their own lives. And it starts to sink in, and they start to listen more.
Volviendo.
And going back more specifically to the novel, I don't know if you investigated about real cases of martyrs at schools in similar places to be able to create Talia's case. And I don't know if you discovered any shared or common aspects in those real cases.
I did not too much research. There were a few cases I looked up because they had to do with high school students. There was a case in Ohio, not a very well-known case, from 1990 in Ohio. Very, very different, but a young woman was killed. And I looked to that for several reasons. One was, it was very interesting to see that the way that these high school students banded together and came up with sort of a group narrative. Not I don't think to protect any one person. I don't think that they all knew the truth, but they all compared notes long before they talked to the police. And I think for teenagers more than anyone, there's that danger of thinking, trying to think like your friends, tell the same story as your friends. I was interested in that, and I was also interested with that case because it remains unsolved in the way that the two main suspects in the case, who were both young men, have been hounded all their life by this suspicion. And so that was something that I was certainly, it was more about the mood or the feeling, the psychology, rather than details. But I was also interested because that was a case where the interview transcripts with these teenagers have been released and are all online. So I was able to look at the way that police might question a teenager, the way a teenager might respond, which was also very useful. But I already had, just because of things I had listened to or watched or read or things you hear about, I already had these sort of catalogs of these cases in my head. And that's even, of course, something I use in the book, is this motif of these lists of cases that are in Bodhi's head, my narrator. She can just, think of all these different cases that she has stored away over the years.
We've talked about something at the beginning before this session. We were talking about what's so fascinating about true crime, and you actually said, why do we talk about them as true crime? Why don't we talk about fiction crime and non-fiction crime? Maybe that would be a better way to categorize this. But reading
was just, why don't we call it crime?
Sí, efectivamente.
Yeah.
Delito, simplemente.
Yes, exactly. That's it. And reading your novel, I remembered an essay from the year 2010 from the Social Psychology and Personality Science. It's an article, fascinating article, about why women are attracted by violations or rapes and serial murders and all those cases. Maybe you know about this essay, and the thesis was scary for me. It said that women listen to that kind of content to be prepared in case we sometimes have to deal with a jealous ex-partner becoming violent, for example. I had never thought about true crime contents as didactic pieces, almost something that we would listen to know how I will react, or how I could react if something like that happened to me. I don't know if you had heard about this theory and if you think it's right.
Yeah, I've heard that theory, I think, many places, and I share that theory. I think it's something hardwired into us. I think it's, something that humans have done for all of human history, that, you either, if someone's dead, you either want to figure out, did they make some mistake that I can avoid? And of course, sometimes that turns into blaming the victim, but even so, you can maybe learn, even if it's not that, you can learn, okay, don't date this certain type of men, don't, hitchhike at night, things that are very useful to know. And so we either are looking for the mistake that we can avoid, or we're looking for the person who did this that we can find and lock away and blame. And those are both things that we would have needed to do throughout all of human history. If you're living in a small village, or if you're in a small band of nomadic people, you either need to figure out what went wrong that you shouldn't do, or you need to figure out who to exile from your group. The difference now is that instead of only hearing the news for the couple of hundred people you know, we hear all the news for the entire planet. Mm-hmm. And we still are, we still have that impulse. It's just like we also have the instinct to eat as much fatty and sugary food as we can, because that used to be very rare. Mm-hmm. And now that you can get that out of the vending machine and it's everywhere around you, the danger is we still have that instinct, but we have too much of this, so we don't know when to stop. And I think it's very similar. I think we have, and women particularly, are going to have that instinct for self-preservation. I need to look directly at this dangerous thing so I know what the worst thing is, and I can prepare myself. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's conscious, or maybe it's, in the subconscious. But the problem now is how much of it we have. And so, as a reader or a listener, you need to think a lot about, what am I doing to myself to consume this much of it? Is that good for me? Is it bad for me? Am I having a lot of nightmares? But as I said before, I don't think the interest is new. I think the amount of media mm-hmm. is what's new. And I need to think for myself, for me, I'm not interested in the serial killer stuff, the blood and gore. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the unsolved mystery part. Mm-hmm. Let's figure out what happened here. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe we're all supposed to be interested in different parts of it, so that in a small group of humans, mm-hmm. Someone would figure out what went wrong, someone would obsess about this kind of thing, someone would be in charge of kicking someone out. Maybe we all have those different interests for that reason.
It's very interesting in your novel to see how students make Body think about some things that she maybe hadn't thought about because of the age difference. And I think it's Bree, one of the students, that tells her about an idea, which is that fetish aspect of crimes. There's a moment in the novel where you say, I am disturbed by the way the bodies, the women bodies, they have become public property, subject to the collective imagination. I am disturbed by the fact that the women whose deaths worry me are mostly beautiful and rich, and white, I would add, which is also important in the novel. Also, that most of them are young, like the lambs that we choose to slaughter. It's true that we see that profile of the victims, which is very similar in many of the cases, right?
Yes, and that was part of the project of this book, basically, was to take the kind of case, the kind of murder that would be all of those kind of perfect crime elements. The beautiful, young, white, rich girl in the boarding school in the woods. The kind of thing, the kind of story that would be fetishized, that people would claim as kind of public property and talk about again and again. And it's also the story that seems to have this perfect villain, and they caught him, and this great evidence against him, and this perfect tidy ending. They locked him away, and that's the end of the story. My project, in part, was to take that story, that kind of story, and to examine it looking at it through the lens of realism. So, really realistically, what does that kind of attention do to an investigation, to the police, to the court system? how do those investigations actually work? How does a confession really work? How does the legal system really work? What happens really in prison? So it's like taking this thing that seems like the kind of stylized, fairy tale. It's the thing that makes a very nice 30-minute TV episode or nice podcast, and breaking it apart and showing how messy it really is. And the realism in all of that. What does this really look like? What does it really reflect in society more broadly? And what are all the mistakes that might have been made along the way?
And there's another interesting reflection I hadn't noticed until I read your book, because you make us wonder what happens with the victim's intimacy. What happens once they cannot decide if the details of their deaths are going to be examined, so closely examined? And quite often, maybe in this morbid way. So it's important that we think about the rights of that person that does not exist anymore, and their intimacy, their privacy. So I don't know if you have a conclusion about this.
What I can say is, yes, I don't really have, some answer to all that, but it was interesting for me because I was writing fiction. I was not dealing with a true story in any way. It's not based on a true story. It's not inspired by a true story. There's no true story there. So I was able, I didn't have those ethical concerns, which was very nice, right? So I could simultaneously lean in to that story. Hey, let's talk about it. Let's tell this story because Thalia is not real. And I could critique that exact same kind of telling. So the book is having it both ways, which of course puts the reader intentionally in the uncomfortable position of having it both ways. Having this story that you want to, maybe know all the details about, but also thinking about why do I want to know the details, and does this kind of story belong to all of us? So if nothing else, I can say that I was definitely playing with that question of, the victim now doesn't have a voice. And in this case, the convicted man does not have a voice. Although I make sure to give him one quite late in the novel. But for most of the novel, he really doesn't have a voice. So how do I can use that, I can show that, but I can critique that at the same time. I can make you feel very uncomfortable about the story that you're participating in, even as I hope you might be enjoying it.
Me interesa también.
I'm also interested about other additional aspects in the novel. We have crimes against women with a very specific perspective, but there are other reflections as well about, for example, the social difference or social classes, because when Bodhi goes back to the boarding school, she realizes that she was not a girl just like the other girls from a rich family, but when she goes back, she is, in a way, because, well, she has a professional career now, a successful professional career, and I was interested about that the difference that she sees in the social status. And you also mentioned something before about racism. So in what way those prejudices in the United States and also in other countries we see these, but especially in the US, the main the guilty person here in this case is a black man, and just because he's black, he's more likely to be convicted in the end. And in the last part of the novel, I'll ask you about that later, but it's a novel where that last part is very legal. We have that part of the hearing where you analyze the rights that they have in prisons, and that's very interesting as well. And I would like you to talk about these other aspects of the plot, racism and social class differences.
Yeah, I think partly because I'm writing about a boarding school, although people, including in the US, people have this idea that an American boarding school is all very rich kids. That's not the case. That was the case 70 years ago. Now they're very diverse places, including economically diverse, definitely racially diverse. And even in the book, I think you see a difference when she remembers school in 1995, as she's looking back. She's remembering, a school where she was maybe one of the only kids who wasn't very wealthy. And when she returns to teach this class in 2018, it's much broader spectrum of kids. That boarding school campus is sort of a microcosm, right? The kids from all different backgrounds are sort of smashed together and have to live together for 4 years in isolation, really, in the woods. So those differences in class and race and religion and all those things, they're going to come under pressure. Kids are going to come under conflict. And one of the things that Bodhi needs to realize throughout the novel, some of the more personal realizations she has, are about the fact that she really was not as much of an outsider as she thought she was. She saw herself as, because she wasn't as rich, she saw herself as being very much an outcast. Of course, every teenager thinks they're an outcast. Every teenager thinks they're unpopular and everyone's laughing at them. But she has to confront later on that although she might have felt like an outsider at this school, she was a part of the school. She had the privilege of that education, and this was the same school that put pressure on the police and found this guy to put in prison. Although she didn't choose to be part of it, she's part of a country that has this justice system and this carceral system, this prison system. And although she didn't ask to be part of it, she's part of the institutions of whiteness in America. And she has benefited from being a part of those things. She's not nearly as much of an outsider as she thought. And someone like Omar, who is in prison, not only is much more of an outsider, but was specifically victimized by the institutions that she's part of. And she needs to, I think, as she at the same time takes action to fix that, she also has to recognize that, and recognize that she was not fully the outcast that she thought she was. And she can't, feel sorry for herself in that way forever and ever. So that's happening. It's also, of course, just reflected, I think, realistically in the story of what would happen in the courtroom, what happens in prison. And I researched a lot to write those parts of the book, not giving anything away here, but in the last quarter of the book, there are some legal proceedings. And I think that it certainly is tempting, and I see why a lot of writers and a lot of screenwriters make a nice, tidy story and make sure everything wraps up, magically in the end in terms of the legal system. But the more I researched, the more I realized how very complicated it is. And I worked very closely with a public defender, a defense attorney in New Hampshire, who could tell me very specifically about the laws of that state and the court system in that state. And there were so many times when I wanted something to happen and I'd ask her and she'd say, no, that really can't happen. And then I'd say, what about this? And she'd say, yeah, that hasn't happened in 50 years. That's just never happens. So again and again, I'd have these doors shut even on what was possible. Of course, I think that did make it a better book because it made it a more realistic book. But there are questions, of course, then, with it, not to give too much away, within all of those details in that story about race, about class. If you are not a wealthy person, you get a very different trial than if you're someone who doesn't come from as much money.
Sí, de
Actually, there's a moment in the book, it's at the very beginning, so I'm not doing any spoiler with these, and I think it has to do with what you mentioned about consulting real lawyers. When you say, in real life, you don't get the killer to say exactly what he did and why he did it. And even Omar's confession left big gaps. What I wanted, and I would never get to do, was going back in time and see with my own eyes what had happened. Not the creepy parts, not the death itself, but what had happened. Something that where fate could have stepped aside and left Talia intact, untouched. So in a way, you are trying to leave out that myth of how what we leave out in crime, those confessions that we see at the end that close the story and they tell you exactly what they did. But I think here you're being very realistic and you're saying, well, things are not always like that, right?
Yeah, and I will say, by the end of the book, you do know who did it, right? So that was my one concession to that sort of the murder mystery. I wasn't very interested in a typical detective story. That's not what this is. But I was not going to have it end with, we'll never know, that's, isn't life weird, and there's no ending to the book. I think that wouldn't have been fair to the reader. But what I decided early on that I would not do is jump back in time and show you what happened. We're going to be stuck in the present, trapped in the present, just like Bodhi is, trying to look back but not knowing. And I was also never going to have that moment. I think of it as the villain moment in a superhero movie. You think about, the villain has tied the hero, the superhero, to the chair, and he goes, okay, now I'm gonna boil you alive, but before I do, I'm gonna tell you my whole evil plan and how I did it and what's gonna happen next. And because you know that he's gonna get caught anyway, but now everything's revealed, right? Or sometimes it's the murderer in a thriller, right? That is of course not realistic, and I decided that was not going to happen. So that said, you do still know, I think the reader gets that satisfaction, and there is hope also, I think, at the end of the book, even though the legal system is very difficult. It's something, I think there can be a lot of satisfaction in reading when the book does what we can't do in real life, which is hop into different people's heads, or travel back in time to show us what really happened, or jump into the future to show us what happens later, right? And I've done those things in books. I have books where things jump around. I have a novel that was not translated into Spanish. This is my second novel. Mm-hmm. In English, it's called The 100-Year House, where it's basically the story of one house, but we go backwards in time through the 20th century. So we slowly learn what had already happened there, and what happened before that, and what happened before that. It was very fun for me to write because it's this sort of wish fulfillment, right? Mm-hmm. Like, don't you wish, this is a very old building, I understand, right? Don't you wish that you could just have the video footage of everything that ever happened in this building from the earliest time, right? And see who was here, what famous people, what they did. We can't do that in real life. And so it was a lot of fun, in that case, to do that in the book, to give people that experience, and to give myself that experience. Mm-hmm. And here I made the decision to do the exact opposite, right? We're stuck in one person's head. We're stuck in the present. We don't get the satisfaction of that super villain confession. We still know what happened. I'm still going to do that. But I really wanted to go for realism, not only realism of what people would do and say, but realism of the human experience, where we're limited to one moment and one person.
Vamos a abrir
We're going to open the floor for the audience very soon, so you can start thinking about your questions. But I had at least one more related to the role of the internet in all these. the social media, because the murder took place in the 90s, but I understand that in 2024, murder like this, a case like this, with the internet, with the social media, would have had a totally different impact, right? But there are in the internet, like Reddit, for example, where many people. I always wonder who is writing on those media, what are the people that are taking time to research, to investigate about these cases, and they spend time in discussing and debating about their theories. And in a way, this reminded me of the Disney Plus series, The Only Murders in the Building, which is also a true crime piece. And so what's the role of the internet or the World Wide Web in all these cases? And how do you think that 30 years, 35 years difference, a case like this would be totally different, right? Nowadays it would be maybe double damage to the victim.
This was something that I think that I had a lot of fun with the contrast between 1995 and 2018, 2022, which is the two times of the book, just in the way information is spread. I do not have a lot in common with Bodhi. She's not me, but I did give her my high school graduation year, which was 1995. Mm-hmm. And I did that partly because it was easier. I could speak with a lot more authority about the music and the clothes and what we were talking about, and also just the ethos of the time. How, what did harassment in the hallway look like in 1995? But along with that, one reality of that time is, when I was in high school, the only people who used the internet, it existed. There was a web surfing club at the school, and it was only the nerdiest boys who were in this club. The thick glasses and and there were maybe 5 of them, and they would go and they would surf the web, and we all thought this was so funny. So for most of us, we were not on the internet at all. And then my first day of college that fall, I was handed an index card that had my email address on it, and that was my first email address. Mm-hmm. So for me, high school was no internet, and starting on the first day of college, we had the internet. And you think about the way that information spread at that time in the 90s. These students in the book, they have payphones in their dormitories. They could read the newspaper, they could watch TV, but they really were isolated from the outside world. And by the time we get to the 2018 and 2022 parts of the book, not only is it a world in which you can reach the outside world very quickly. Like a student podcast could reach a global audience. But it's also a world in which the outside can reach you. So people can find out someone's address and track them down and harass them, or they have theories and they're trying to contact people, or they're really, poking around in this. So we see the evolution over time of this case. What was once a local news story, by the early aughts, there's a television special about it, just, Dateline, which is just this kind of news show. But then by later on, there are websites devoted to freeing Omar from prison. And eventually we have just, podcasts and Reddit boards and Twitter and everything. It wasn't something that I went in there, trying to make a point or with some design about, I'm going to do this thing with technology. It just happened because I was writing really about these two times, so they were naturally going to be a part of the story. I think that exactly this is the kind of case that if it happened now, people, for one thing, would be coming in and running around all over the crime scene. Mm-hmm. We've seen that happen sometimes. There was a case in England recently where people were running around in this park and messing up the crime scene. And who knows what else, but also maybe they would have solved it correctly quicker because people know something. There's a very famous case in the US in South Carolina recently, this wealthy man who murdered his wife and son. And for a while, it really looked like he would have gotten away with it, partly because it was a small town and his family had so much influence in this town. They were all lawyers and judges and everyone was afraid of him. And it was really only because of the national attention, podcasts, I think there was like a Netflix special and an HBO special. Because of that attention, I think he got the trial he deserved, which was one in which he was convicted.
Bueno.
Okay, so let's open the floor for the audience for some questions. If any of you would like to ask a question. If not, I have some more.
Who's brave, who asks the first question.
Es lo más difícil. Sí, el rompehielos de la pregunta.
Yes, the question icebreaker, please. But if not, I have a few.
Wow,
sí.
Yeah.
Sí, una de ellas.
Well, one of the questions I have left is about the topic of the book. We've been talking about the topic of the book, but the plot, but not the style, the writing style. And when I was reading the novel, there is something that you do, which is that you use, the narrator addresses that you, which is Denise Block, a professor, a music teacher. And reading the episodes, those chapters in the book, it felt like if the narrator was looking at the camera, right? These chapters are chapters where the narrative changes. It's not the first person narrator anymore. I don't know if Body is a reliable narrator or not, but in those chapters where she's addressing the teacher are a little bit shocking, but then you join the game. And I wanted to ask you about that decision that you made, about the style, about the writing. And I also wanted to ask you, because it's a book from the literature point of view, it can be demanding for the reader, and I want to be respectful towards other more simple crime novels. This one has a very clear style, right?
Yeah, I think one thing I have to consider, that any writer has to consider, for any novel, but especially a first-person novel, is theoretically, why is this story being told? To whom? When? Is the narrator speaking as if to a close friend or as if to the whole world? Mm-hmm. Are they explaining everything to us as if we don't know this town and these people? Or are they talking to us as if we already do know this town and these people? So you have to answer that question one way or another. And it doesn't mean that there has to be a character who's meant to be listening, but you still need to make those decisions. And I hadn't really made them yet. I sometimes don't make them until later. But I knew from the beginning that I wanted her to be thinking a lot about this one teacher, this music teacher, who was very close to the students, but it's the kind of person who, when you look back later, you think, oh, maybe he was too close to the students. And in fact, he was very close to Thalia, to the young girl who was killed, and was never investigated. And I wanted him to really be on her mind. And it started to make sense to me that she would really be thinking almost at him, if that makes sense, in the way that sometimes if you're very mad at someone, you just are narrating to them in your head, or if you really miss someone, you're sort of talking to them in your head. It's not that you're writing them a letter, you're just sort of thinking at them. And I had maybe that idea, and then I found myself at the end of the first chapter writing, and really just writing a you there. And of course, we try many things as we write, and we throw a lot of them away. But in this case, I felt like, yes, I like that. I like what it's doing. I'm going to keep that, and I'm going to use that throughout. I feel like it does maybe implicate the reader a bit. It does, it also gives me a focal point for the narration, right? This is who it's directed to. So she'll only need to explain the things he doesn't already know. She would, this is, now we know why she's telling it, or we learn why she's kind of saying this stuff. We have the idea of when. So it answered those questions for me. It's been interesting, though, I have to say, because in different languages, it's made translating the title very different. So even, in English, it's I have some questions for you, and that you could be lots of people. It could be one person. It could be a close friend. It could be a stranger. And, we have the decision has to be made here. Okay, usted. Well, it's a little bit more formal, and it's I think singular, right? So, I knew that. I just am doubting sometimes I doubt my Spanish. But then in a language like Polish, they had to. In Polish, I guess the verbs change in terms of who you're speaking to. It's a very complicated language. So. Basically, the implication in the gender of who you're speaking to changes the verb. So essentially, it had to be translated as "I have some questions for you, sir." So there's not an extra word, but from the title that she's speaking to a man who's older than her. Rather, it's very specific. I actually enjoy that, learning that stuff, that part of it. But and that title certainly might make an older man feel more implicated and a younger woman not feel included in that you. But I do think the title as well has that effect, hopefully, kind of, including the reader in the story. Even though we learn that the you is Mr. Block, it is also, at least when you first pick the book up, it is also the reader.
Es un personaje.
It's a mysterious character within the novel. So, second chance for the audience. See, finally, with some questions. Yes.
This interesting talk. So, I wanted you to ask, how do you think it contrasts the authority that unstable people or potential killers have regarding person towards exposure on social media? Meaning, so in the 90s, there wasn't that much information of the people around you, but now it's there's a lot of stuff, so we're not to blame on that. But my question would be, do you think that these unstable people or potential killers are given themselves more authority just because they have more data or they have more insights on the person they want to target, just because they're not to blame, of course, but maybe, okay, I know more about this man, this woman. I know how to tarnish, undermine, or just pursue this person.
That's a very interesting question. I think, the nature, if someone becomes obsessive about a former partner or a celebrity or a stranger, the nature of how they might stalk that person has definitely changed, right? It used to be someone's outside your house, and it might look much more just like constantly updating their Instagram feed now. Maybe that fulfills that need for some people, and then they don't act dangerously. We can hope, but also, I think it gives for everyone, and just all of us. This is not about killers, but it gives all of us a false sense sometimes that we know someone, that we know them very well. I can forget sometimes that I haven't met someone in real life. For instance, even just I'll have a good friend who's always, I maybe knew someone in school who's always posting photos of her family. And I know the names of all the kids, and I know her husband. I know all these things about them. And if I met the husband, I would expect him to know me too, but he doesn't. Even I've seen, hundreds of pictures of him over the years. I've watched him go bald, right? I think, within this book, the place where that comes out the most, I have in the book, in the modern day, a YouTuber, this guy who has sort of taken it upon himself to solve this case, and in a very creepy way. It seems, he really feels like this case belongs to him. He really seems to kind of be fetishizing this. He seems obsessed with Thalia, in a way that's very, very disturbing to Bodhi, the narrator. And I needed him to be in the book. I needed that character, the person who, maybe very different than whoever was obsessed with Thalia in the 1990s. This person is obsessed with this idea of her now, and it's in the digital age. He doesn't really know her. It's this very modern way of feeling ownership over someone that can be very dangerous.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Sí.
Any other questions?
I haven't read the book yet, although I'm quite excited. Before in the talk, you mentioned that you didn't want to jump back in time as you have done in previous novels. But in this novel, and again, I haven't read it, so I might be messing this up. There is like an initial moment in 1995 or so, and then time moves as well. So wouldn't that be also a jump in time?
That's a very good question. So the difference is that rather than us witnessing it directly, it doesn't say 1995 at the top of the page and then we're there, but then time jumps. We're starting in 2018, and we slowly learn through Bodhi's memories what she remembers of 1995. So there's a difference, and I'm always talking to my writing students, will always talk in this very vague way about flashback. And I'm always stopping them and saying, no, what do you mean by flashback? Do you mean we're jumping there because there's a term for that? Do you mean that we're using memory? And if we're using memory, does it really go into a long extended scene, or are we just being told a bit about the memory? There are all these different ways to do that, right? And I made the decision, not only are we staying here, and she's just saying, well, I remember this, and the reason I remember it is because it was the first day of the spring sports season, so I remember, and that's why I'm sure that this happened. She's kind of, commenting even on her memories as she shares them with us. But also, I was interested in kind of calling her memories into question, right? She thinks she remembers something and then realizes that wasn't really the way it happened. She remembers things one way, someone else remembers them another way. And because I never took you there, I didn't say 1995, interior, day, here we are. We are just in the same situation she is, which is not knowing how much we can trust her memory. By the way, I would not expect any of you to have read it. It only came out like 3 days ago, right? 2 days ago in Spanish. You would have to be a very fast reader to have already bought it and read the entire thing and then showed up tonight.
¿Hay alguna pregunta?
Any other question? I do have one more question, because we talked about many underlying aspects in the novel, social, legal aspects, but there's something else, which is entertainment, enjoying reading a novel, and especially a book like this. Do you think that a reader that maybe is not necessarily interested in the plot or in some of the things that you deal with in the novel, I think that it's a book that they can enjoy anyway, right? Maybe someone who does not have that social perception, maybe, but so maybe you would like people to read it anyway, like with that other vision. I'm sure your publishers will like it to be read anyway, but I don't know if it's a dilemma for you.
Yeah, no, I think I always want to write novels that work even if you're only reading on the surface level, right? I want to tell just a good story. And then, depending who you are, the more you think about it, the more you discuss it, maybe you find a lot more there. But I joke that it's like when you put spinach in brownies for a little kid, you mix the spinach into the brownie batter, and so they're eating the brownies, but they don't know that they're getting their vegetables also, right? So sometimes you can just enjoy the brownie, and that's fine, and that's it. And I would never be upset if someone just said, "Oh, it was a great whodunit, and I thought it was this person, turned out to be this person." I think that's definitely not only a valid way to enjoy the book, but something I thought very hard about. That's part of the reason that I didn't want to end on "we'll never know," right? I wanted it to be a good story with a good arc. And I think a lot about the structure of stories. I think a lot about momentum in a story. I think as a writer, you have to earn every turn of the page from the reader. There are so many things in the world that someone could read. There are so many distractions. There's so many reasons to put a book down and not pick it up again. I can't assume that I have someone's attention, that because they started the book, of course they're going to finish the book. I have to, earn every single page turn. So not only do I not mind if someone simply reads it for that, I take great pride in it working on that level, because that's something I've worked very hard for, that it works as a story, and storytelling is harder than you think. There was a long time, even in the study of writing, of creative writing, when people didn't want to talk about plot because they said, "Oh no, that's for the romance novelists, that's for the thrillers, we're talking about deep, important things." But then, does anyone want to read that story? And also, plot is a skill. It's an art. It's really difficult to learn. And I'm not someone who tends to read thrillers or romance novels, that kind of thing. I tend to want more substance in the books I read, but I have huge admiration for the people who can just tell a great story and sell 1 million copies of their books and do it once a year and get everybody to read every time. Those people are geniuses.
Sí.
They're not doing the same thing I am, but they are geniuses. And so I absolutely hope that it can be read that way, and I hope that, I would say for this audience, you are all people who came to a book event voluntarily. You are probably deeper readers. So I hope that for all of you, you enjoy it on that level, but also get something more out of it.
Totalmente.
Yes, totally. And we have another question here.
Either one is fine.
She has translations.
Like about the creative part, because I was curious that I haven't read the novel yet, but I think it's a long novel in comparison with what we are getting used to, and so I was curious if your draft, but I don't know if it's too personal, if your draft was much more longer, or it was kind of that, and after you change it, or like everything started with a short story, and after you started developing the plot, or first was the plot and...
Yeah. That's a good question. I've definitely worked both ways. The novel I was speaking about previously that goes backwards in time, it started as a short story that did not work at all, and it became a novel. I also have had novel ideas that became short stories. But for most of my novels, I write, more than I need. Which is not a bad thing, because you have more material to choose from. Sometimes you just have to write all this, clear out this kind of junk, write all this stuff to get to the good stuff. And so it was much longer than this, and then it shrinks down. And then, of course, we have the issue of, in other languages, sometimes it gets longer. Like the German translations of my books, you could sit on it, a child could sit on it as a booster seat. But my first 2 novels were actually quite a bit shorter. My last 2 have been longer. And I would love to write another short novel, but it's often just a matter of, what size of story am I telling, the topic, the amount of stuff I need, how long does it need to be? And what I worked very hard to do in this book, and I hope is true, is that although it's a long novel, it's also a fast novel, right? Because I have read some short novels that have taken me a long time because they're very dry. It's big. It's good for killing bugs with, but hopefully, it's the kind of book that you might read, in a weekend or in a week, not over 6 months. I hope.
Sí, es un libro.
Yes, it's quite an addictive book. And you read it fast. Yes, if you have the time, of course, that you can spend reading. So, Rebecca, thank you very much for presenting your book here. You can't wait to read it, and you haven't. So there are a few over there, so you can buy them. And of course, Rebecca will be signing them. So thank you very much again for coming, and thank you, Rebecca, for being here.